Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for all being here. And I just want to start off by, as indicated here, sponsors are always important, and I work really closely with Tech Savvy. And I know Tech Savvy really has been involved in many years of advocacy to the CRTC and the community, so I want to really thank Tech Savvy. I was a director with Eastlink and Persona, the cable company, for about 10 years as a managing director for the business division in Ontario and Quebec. So that's where I was able to work really closely with a lot of the ISPs and the larger carriers and all across the country. When we look at, and I kind of, one of the comments of the speakers, that politicians have no clue, I'm trying hard. And I did work in the industry, and I did voice over IP too, so with previous companies, with VNet and others. So when we look at the importance, and obviously here, you understand this when we look at the importance of internet, but also I really want to thank, when we look at the group that you have here today, when you're looking at the internet, like secure, affordable, and accessible to all Canadians, it's really important. So when we look at an era here, and distinguishing between fiction and facts, and when we look at the safeguard and the democracy, and when we look at the freedoms that we've earned here as all Canadians cherish, it's really important that we continue to look at that open access for internet. So when we look at broadband, and we look at rural, Indigenous, and remote communities, that's what I've been asked to speak to. I really understand that in a meaningful way from my years of experience. I come from Northern Ontario, Nickel Belt, and I understand either no access to internet or very limited access, or when we look at DSL congestion and a lot of the issues that when we look at the government saying that the community is serviced because they have DSL, which is not correct. So we got to look at changing that. So also personally, as a father of 5 at home, where the internet is pretty slow, we're always fighting to make sure that kids don't do a lot of streaming because it's going to cost a fortune. So I do not have at my home actually access to reliable high-speed internet. But I like living in the bush and I like fishing, so yeah, you kind of got compromised. But I'm working on ensuring that we try to expand the internet access all over Canada. When we look at remote communities, it's really important that we look at the importance. 30% of our country's GDP links back to remote areas. And when we look at the natural resources, agricultural, and when we look at the economic development, we need to ensure that we have a deep commitment to internet in those areas. And this is where at the start of the year, as a caucus, as a government, as MPs, we worked hard with Cabinet and the entire caucus, and we're really proud that our Prime Minister appointed Bernadette Jordan, Canada's first Rural Economic Development Minister. And this brings a voice to from rural Canadians at the Cabinet table, and also with a focus on high-speed internet access. And Bernadette will be here later tonight to be speaking to you. And it's really hard to believe this is in the last 5 months, but Minister Jordan and I, we've crossed the country, meeting with hundreds of municipalities, association, community leaders, and really understanding the importance firsthand of how the economic development strategies are linked to ensuring that we have a priority in rural Canada with access to high-speed internet, and making sure that all levels of government make this a priority, working with the private sector. There's no surprise when we look at the internet connectivity in the 21st century, like I said earlier, preaching to the converted here, how important it is. And when we look at natural resources and all over rural Canada, the prosperity, to ensure that we keep our youth and we keep our talent in rural areas. When we look at new integrated technologies, either the autonomous vehicles, when we look at the revolutionizing and agricultural, mining, oil and gas industries, we really need to make sure that we prepare ourselves for the decades to come. Rural communities really fuel these sectors, but we need to stay competitive to ensure that we have high-speed internet. Connectivity in those areas are a major impact, enabling our social opportunities, enabling distance learning, enabling to attract world talent to ensure that we have these services available in the areas. And this is where it's really important to make sure that we don't take the internet for granted, Obviously, when we look at the nation's capital and many of the urban centers, student university colleges that have high-speed internet capacity and networks, it's really important to look at when we talk about Canary and connecting the university networks all across the country to ensure the students have that opportunity to expand. But we also need to make sure that those markets expand all across the country, not just in big cities, but also when we look at doctors, when we look at businesses, when we look at people starting own businesses, the potential is really, really enormous to expand that in all across Canada. So make no mistake, when we look at rural communities, the driving force, when we look at innovation, when we look at exports, these are facts that in remote areas, the challenge is great, and we need to ensure that we have broadband, internet, and cell coverage, digital access in those areas. So when we look at 9 out of 10 urban households have access to high-speed internet. 1 in 3 rural households have access to the same service. So 9 out of 10, one out of 3 in rural. We need to change that. We need to work to ensure we change that. These carry significant consequences depending upon where you live. So when we have rural communities, when we're looking at healthcare, when we're looking at physicians, it's really, really a limitation on the access to, or the limited access to high-speed internet. So when we look at also an aging parents, medical doctors, like I said, access to telemedicine, it's really looking at expanding that aspect. So let's stop and think about when we look at also on the agricultural side, 12% of Canadian exports, $62.5 billion, which employs 575,000 people, utilize big data, sensors, drones, robotics, artificial intelligence every day. But in a lot of these areas, even if they have limited DSL, it's very low speed and congestions happen on a regular basis in these small areas. So when we look at expanding that connectivity, it's really important that we consider looking at the small business. And that's where one of the key areas here on expanding businesses and ensuring that you could develop your business and looking at adding that aspect in all of connectivity here. So poor internet connectivity can limit the country's ability to retain, as I indicated earlier, our youth. Make sure that we're able to attract Canadians with high skills. And that's where it's important to make sure that that is expanded. When we look at students in rural communities, often have to travel long distances to get to school, or issues that could be less partially resolved by enhancing the distance of learning, enabling by the internet. Consider College of the Northern Atlantic, for example, in Newfoundland and Labrador, which was developed long-distance learning. Contact North and Northern Ontario, there's many examples how this is important. For example, in Newfoundland, there's 300 communities that can access 200 courses, programs online for the digital access when you're looking at engineering, software programs, and it's really crucial that that continues to happen. Programs like this in local communities drive skilled workers, and that's where we need to do to grow in rural areas. So thanks to these programs, rural Canadians have no longer have the ability and also are able now to learn their skills and have the better paying jobs. And that's the importance of ensuring that high-speed internet is provided in rural areas. Broadband is a great enabler for people in rural areas to maintain a positive position in coming years. Need to have access to strong broadband. And this is where our government has made historic investments in broadband and wireless infrastructure. Through our Connect to Innovate program, we've extended high-speed internet to more than 900 communities. Our goal was 300. We've added 190 Indigenous communities, 380,000 households, and 1,100 anchor institutions. This is 3 times what the original forecast was. This represents, when we look at the fiber backbone of the Connect and Innovate, 20,000 kilometers of fiber that was installed. And this represents from St. John's to Vancouver, when you're looking at Whitehorse, Yellowknife, Inuit, Labrador, and back to St. John's. Fiber is important, but there's also other alternatives. This program was launched in 2016. Fiber was announced 174 projects worth $454 million. And this program itself leveraged over $1 billion. And I know, and maybe some of you were in this room that have applied, there was $4.4 billion worth of proposals submitted for $500 million. $500 million is still a lot of money, but there's still not enough. So that's something that we've added now in budget 2019, even more to add to that, and I'll explain that a bit later on. But for example, our government has partnered with Sasktel Flex Networks to invest close to $22 million for high-speed internet to houses and businesses in 41 rural communities in Saskatchewan. To date, we've invested $64 million in rural and remote areas in Ontario through the Connect Innovate program. This is $37 million of this was supporting 880 kilometers of new fiber optic cable to five fly-in Northern Ontario First Nations communities. So this is just examples, and we're just getting started. I'm thrilled to be part of a government that realizes that being part of the digital economy, connecting rural areas and remote is a priority. These broadband investments are helping residents in rural and remote areas across the country to connect with families and friends, do business online, access telemedicine, participate in distance education. And that's why in budget 2019, our government has made another historic investment to make sure that we'll start. Right now, we got about 83% of Canadians that are connected to the internet. What we're looking at by 2021 is 90%. By 2026, 95%. And by 2030, 100%. How are we going to do this? And it doesn't matter where you live. And the last 5% will be challenging when we look at Inuit and Northwest Territories. But we have some options, and we're working on that right now, and with Telesat and Leo, so there are some good, massive Canadian company that is working on these aspects. When we look at the population across the country, and we look at the need to ensure that all levels of government work together, provincially, federally, and the private sector. That's why we've added in 2019 budget $1.7 million to broadband, to create a new universal fund, to build upon the Connect Innovate. So there were some criteria to Connect Innovate, needing your feedback moving forward to see this new fund, the Universal Broadband Fund, which we, as a federal government, has put $1.7 million that we hope by adding the CRTC $750 million, and then some of the leveraging that's going to happen with the provinces, that we're going to look at that $4 or $5 billion of investment in broadband as we move forward. So we recognize the importance of doing this and taking the leadership as a federal government. And that's what when I mentioned earlier about the new generation wireless networks, such as the 5Gs and the low Earth orbit satellites, LEO, which are really important to look at that last mile, or in many areas, the connectivity that will replace currently satellites that have latency issues. And Leo and Telesat is working hard on ensuring that, and the testing are really good to ensuring that there's no latency. So when we look at us providing as a federal government also dollars to Telesat to ensure that they do the R&D and the innovation to make sure they deploy with that also the 5G networks. These technologies can be transformative to really transform consumers and business all across Canada, regardless of the region that you're living. So just before I conclude, I want to highlight Canada's new digital charter, and I'm sure you had an opportunity to talk about this today, that Minister Baines launched last week. The charter's principle lay the foundation to modernize the rules that govern the digital sphere in Canada. It's not an easy task, as you know, but this is critical to ensuring that Canadians could trust their privacy and that it is protected. And when they participate in the digital and data economy, whatever their participation is through any of the businesses online or using social media platforms. And as you know, this week we have countries from all over the world here discussing just the issues that we have with online and the larger companies like Facebook and Google. So to conclude, building a nation in the high speed in the 21st century is really important. You all know this, but we have to ensure that we keep advocating. And yes, when you indicated about the politicians earlier, keep advocating to your local MPs, keep advocating to your local provincial politicians to ensure that the message gets across and that we make this happen. High-speed and wireless connectivity is essential to ensure that businesses and education and thriving communities happen. So I like to close by quoting your society's motto: the internet is for everyone. Let's make it happen, and the federal government is behind you. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marc. And you know, it's so rare to have politicians in the job that actually come from industry, that know what we're talking about today, because we get really into the weeds in here, and just having you around, it makes such a difference for us. I hope you can stay. We're about to go into cocktails, everyone. What I will say is thank you to all of our, we've been live streaming all day. Thank you to all the participants that have joined us remotely. Thank you to our team who's been actively making sure that can happen. We will all join me at the back of the room for cocktails. We will be joined by Minister Bernadette Jordan very shortly, who will mix and mingle and chat with all of us. Thank you all, Franca, for all of your hard work that you've been doing. To our sponsors, we couldn't do it without you. Let's celebrate. Thank you.